Portugal is a wonderful country, famous for its stunning mountain scenery and its coastline filled with beautiful beaches and dramatic cliffs. This coastline hosts busy, vibrant ports which serve a seafaring nation of friendly people devoted to the Catholic Church, and people who indulge themselves in great seafood and delicious wine. As you drive around the country, you can see remnants from its past in the castles which decorate the countryside, and its palaces that display the wealth acquired from South American shores. But as per usual, our focus was on some of the more mysterious ancient sites that were officially built thousands of years before the pyramids, or any of the other more famous megalithic structures from across Europe.
So this is where we are going to begin our tour of Portugal. This is known as the Stonehenge of Portugal, although that's just a term for the tourist board basically, because there's not much similarity between the two sites. This one is 2,000 or 2,500 years older than Stonehenge. It's supposed to have been built around 7000 BC, although it actually was built over a period of 2,000 years because it was built in different stages. The first was 2 round circles at the lower point of the hill, and then later on they built 2 ovoid circles. So that's what you can see at the top here. This would be the top end of the ovoid circles. Let's go and have a little look. I'm sure you can see the beautiful view behind me. This is about 10 kilometers from Evora in an area known as the Megalithic Universe. You can see countryside that's just full of dolmen and standing stones and circles. And we're going to have a little look around that area, of course, before we head on further north. This is obviously sloping down. This is north, so this is the circle. All these circles are running in a sort of east to west, more or less, orientation. There is another standing stone associated with this site. It's called the Menhir of Almendras. It's about 1 kilometer off in that direction. And when you draw a line between this circle and that menhir, it points towards the sunrise on the summer solstice. So that's quite an interesting point. There are also other alignments that have been associated with this for different points of the calendar, a bit like Stonehenge. So that's one of the similarities between this site and Stonehenge. But you can see in terms of the size of the stones, there's obviously no similarity at all between the Stonehenge in England. So as I said, you have 4 circles here, 2 ovoid shape and 2 circular shape, but you also had random stones positioned within the circles. I say randomly positioned, they might have actually been strategically placed, but again, we'll just have to guess as to why they were put where they were. You can see behind me it's really popular. There's quite a lot of people here. People come walking their dogs and just to come and take a look, take a lot of photos. This one's pretty interesting, huh? Looks like it's had a big gouge taken out of it. It's possibly been shaped. And there are others that also look like they've been shaped, such as one on that side. It looks like it's fatter on the top and it kind of does like that, like an upside down vase, I guess, which I also saw in Adam's calendar in South Africa. I saw some stones that had been almost polished and shaped like that, fatter at the top and then skinnier down the bottom. This is the bottom of the stone circle, or 4 circles, and this was supposed to have been the area where there were 2 circles, actual circles. You can see leading uphill there is the other 2 circles or ovoid shapes. So at the top end of the hill is where most of the larger stones are, and I've noticed how a couple of these stones looks like they've had the top of them chopped off. This looks like a really flat cut basically. There's another one on the north side over there as well, but this is the best example. It really just looks like it's been sliced off. This one also maybe, I don't know, it's quite a flat surface, especially because most of them are ovoid or egg-shaped and circular-ish on the top. This one's probably the largest, 2.5 meters, I'd say. Some of the smaller ones are tiny, about 40 centimeters is probably the smallest, even a little bit less, I'd say. So this sign here is showing there are 5 different rocks or stones with carvings on them. It's saying here that 2 and 5 have anthropomorphic shapes on them, which is similar to Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, where they have like arms and things on the side of some of the stones. Personally, looking at these, I'm not sure how they can say that it's anthropomorphic. To be honest with you, that I guess looks like a smiling face a little bit. This has got circles on it. And these, I mean, these look like sperm or some kind of jellyfish or something. These are supposed to be staffs, but it's like just a long curving line, basically. But they don't really know. It states in here they don't really know the purpose of the stone circle, and they don't really know exactly what these mean. So there's a lot of guesswork going on here, but interesting nonetheless. So I'm sure you can see the shadows in this circle getting larger and larger. The sun is going down, starting to get a little bit chilly because we're doing our tour of Portugal in November. Great idea, I'm sure. I think we're going to camp here. It says it's not permitted, but I don't see what harm we're going to do setting up a tent over there. So I think we'll set up a tent and camp here and see what happens tonight.
Nothing much happened, but it was a great place to set up base for the night, and a humbling experience to walk amongst the stones in the dark. And it wasn't too bad coping with the freezing temperature either, although the clouds soon filled the sky and heavy rain caused our tent to leak, soaking most of our stuff. We didn't hang around in the morning as we needed to warm up, so we drove to our next site and waited for a break in the rain.
Okay, so this stone circle is about 10 kilometers from Stonehenge. It's built in a similar style, similar ideas. You can see completely random sized blocks. This one being the biggest is probably about 2.5 meters tall. And then some of these smaller ones are just, you know, 1/2 meter basically. We're noticing crystals forming on the surface, like with almendras as well. Here they are on one side of this stone and then not really here, and then they're on the back as well. And there are other stones around that they basically all seem to be pointing towards the center of the circle. So it's like the crystals are forming on the inside, on the outside as well. Behind this tree, there's a little box with lots of little notes in there. People basically leaving messages when they've come to visit the circle. For example, there's an English couple who got engaged here, so it's obviously really popular with people to come and visit. Like with almendras as well, there's a stone that seems to be kind of cut off. And then there's a stone that looks like it's been shaped as well. As you can see, there's a big gouge taken out of here. I'm not sure if that's the erosive forces, because these sites are obviously really old, but it looks like it's been shaped. It looks like some of the stones we saw in South Africa. The age of this place is, they say it's between 7,000 and 8,000 years old. They've done some excavations here. This site has also been reconstructed and they found all sorts of artifacts. And they think that this was built over 2 phases again. So roughly 7,000 to 8,000 years ago, and also 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, they have artifacts from those times. It's not really a circle. There's 34 stones and it's supposed to be 30 meters in one length and then about 20 by the other. So it's a kind of elliptical shape. There's only 34 left of these stones, so there's probably a hell of a lot more when it was originally built. There's another circle about 1 kilometer away from here, and we're going to try and find it, but it's really difficult because usually when we're finding these sites, you're just driving on the road and you see a pile of stones and then that's your megalithic site, whereas here there's piles of stones all over the place. As I said, this is the Megalithic Universe, and we've seen just driving here piles like old dolmen and just piles of megalithic stones. So this next one's a little bit more difficult to find. We'll have a go, but if not, there's plenty more in this area.
We drove around for ages looking for that circle, but without any signs and the numerous piles of stones acting as decoys, it would have taken us far too long. But we did find some other interesting rocks.
Did you find them?
No, I went to the top of this hill and a few others to have a look, but I just see stone circles everywhere. There's these big boulders, megalithic blocks all over the place, so it's hard to see basically. But this is, look at these are just lying all over this farmland. You can see these big crystals,
been places where there was loads of crystals and little ones all over the place, but in a place known as the Megalithic Universe, this could be pretty significant, I guess. But forget this stone circle. It's okay, there's not much to show there really. There's 40 stones and they've done some excavations there. It's only a small one, it's about 15 metres by 12 metres, which makes it even harder to find. So it's not necessary really, so let's go see some dolmen or something.
We noticed how many of the trees growing in fields were right next to piles of stones, many of which could easily have been the ruins of ancient sites. Vegetation growing in and amongst the ruins is something we have noticed at various places around the world, such as the stone circles in South Africa and the fields of dolmen we saw in the Middle East. And it's an observation that seems to back up John Burke's work, who suggested that seeds placed on the megalithic stones had increased yields, with energy from the stones improving resistance to harsh environmental factors.
What are you doing here at the dolmen?
We're using it as wind shelter to make a cup of tea.
Yeah?
Yeah. It's a collapsed dolmen, probably about 10 stones, quite a big one, 3 metres tall maybe. But it's this was just a random one. We're just driving through the area and we just thought we'd stop here. We didn't even know it existed.
We're at another site about 10 kilometres from Evora. This is a single standing stone of probably about 8 metres tall, 15, 20 tonnes, something like that. There's another standing stone over here as well, but the main feature is pretty obvious, and that's this thing behind me, which is one of the largest dolmen I've ever seen. You've got this corridor made up of about 15 stones here, and then behind me there is a massive chamber. These stones here are about 10 metres tall, probably in the region of 30 tonnes. It's been heavily reconstructed, as you can see. We've got this rather ugly roof, which is making it kind of difficult to film. And you can see all sorts of brickwork and this wooden framework in here as well that's holding up what probably would have been part of the capstone or some capstones. There's another one behind here that's probably about 20 tonnes, a massive slab of rock basically. They think that this was a burial chamber. They found artifacts here like pottery, and they date those back to around 6,000 years ago, 4,000 BC roughly. So as I said, I would estimate that this is the tallest dolmen in the world, to be honest with you. This is about 9 or 10 metres tall. I know you get huge ones in Korea where there's like a 300-ton capstone, but I don't think that they are as tall as this, so pretty cool place.
From there we left the Evora area and headed towards Spain to see a rare type of site, of which there are only a few examples known about around the world.
Behind me here is a pretty interesting site. We are a few kilometres from the Spanish border, and we've come to show what is one of 2 square stone circles or quadrangular stone formations that are known about in the world. There is another one in Carnac in France, and then there is this one as well. It's not a perfect shape. You can probably see along this line here that it's a little bit crooked. This one is a little bit better off in this direction, but then the one on the other side is also a little bit crooked as well. But anyway, a quadrangular stone formation or a square stone circle, which just sounds a bit weird, but anyway. It's quite hotly debated online. There's a lot of argument about whether this was originally a square or quadrangle. It's not in its original location. It used to be about 5 kilometres from here, but in the early 2000s they built a dam and flooded this area as this lake got bigger, and they had to move to this location, which is next to a convent just over here. The reason it's so hotly debated is because the people online say that it wasn't transferred using scientific means. Anyway, for now we'll have to assume that whoever moved it, they did a good job and it was originally like this. There are 52 stones. Most of them are tiny, but this one in the middle is about 4 metres tall and weighs about 7 tonnes. There are a couple of stones over here that have got like a bowl shape carved out of them, where they were probably grinding grain and creating flour and this kind of thing. So it's been used at different times over the years. The artifacts that they found associated with this place in its original location have been dated to around 4,000 BC, so it's roughly 6,000 years old. In its original location, as I said, it was about 5 kilometers from here. It was exactly 110 degrees southeast from the Cromlech Almendres, and along the line between the two of those sites was also the Anta de Zambujeira. So it shows how, you know, a lot of these sites are very deliberately located, and how there's a mathematical or geometrical relationship between a lot of these sites. This is also pretty obvious in places like Carnac in Brittany, in France, and also the area around Stonehenge and Avebury as well, where there are obvious relationships between the distances and the angles between these sites. So we camped here last night and there was an absolutely beautiful sunrise because it's in a pretty flat area, but there's not much else to say about this one really, so we're going to head north and visit a few more sites as we start to go through the centre of Portugal.
Geometric relationships between sites are found all over the globe, and when combined with ley lines they appear to form a grid system, the Becker-Hagens grid being the most up-to-date, although it seems to need some fine-tuning to become more accurate. In his book, Hugh Newman has listed some amazing harmonic distances between major sites across the planet, and the previously mentioned Carnac has many curious numbers that jump out when you look at the layout of this site. For example, it appears that if you draw a line between diagonal corners of the stone rectangle in the Carnac region, the angle it creates matches the latitude of the site's location. And this latitude is unique because both the summer and winter solstices form a perfect Pythagorean triangle relative to the line. And interestingly, these properties are also shared by the station stones at Stonehenge.
Alright, so some of these megaliths just stand out in the middle of the countryside on their own. This is a single standing stone, or a menhir. It's about 5.6 meters tall. It's supposed to be 8 tons with an average diameter of 1 meter. The researchers, looking for reasons as to why our ancestors erected these things, kind of just guess really, in my opinion. This one is supposed to be a phallic shape. It's been described by researchers online as outrageously phallic. They dedicate it to some cult of fertility. Me personally, there's supposed to be a urethra and some penis characteristics on this one, but I don't really see it, to be honest with you. I mean, to say that this is a giant penis and dedicated to some god of fertility is sounds a bit like guesswork to me. But I would imagine that these sites, or these single standing stones, are interacting with other sites in the area, stone circles and dolmen, and they're kind of like amplifiers or transmitters of these energies. David Cowan, for example, has done a lot of work to do with ley lines in Scotland. So he's also said that these are kind of like transmitters of these energies. So that for me sounds like a more realistic explanation, but even still, these are a bit of a mystery really. Yeah, so this one is a bit more than 4 meters tall, I guess. You can see it's been reconstructed. They've stuck 2 halves together. I'm not sure who did it because it doesn't look like a very good job to me. I mean, like the color of the stone doesn't really match on the top and the bottom. It looks a little bit wonky, but still, I'm sure they knew what they were doing. There's an information sign and it says there's some carvings on here. There's supposed to be a sun at the top and some serpentine lines, but I can't see them if I'm honest with you. But still, again, I'm sure they were there, or maybe they saw them under fluorescent light or something. This particular site is listed as a former pagan ritual site. You find that with a lot of these megalithic monuments where they are built on former pagan sites or sacred sites or something like that. Often the church seems to like to build churches on these places. So we're going to visit a few monasteries in the north where they were built on sacred sites as well. So. been to some sacred sites already, like Almendres, Evora also is a sacred site. Now this is probably the most famous in Portugal. It is Fatima, the Sanctuary of Fatima. It's the 100th year anniversary of 3 children getting these visions, giving them predictions about the future. One about the First World War, one about the Second World War, and another one which was about assassination attempt on the Pope, which actually happens exactly 64 years after these children had these visions, apparently. Nowadays, it's this amazing building. Here you've got people flocking here. There's people crawling on their knees all the way down this slope, and they're praying as they walk along. There's a massive queue, actually, of people with candles. I guess they're making prayers and throwing these candles into these huge fires. So it's an interesting place. It's obviously very significant to a lot of people, as you can see. So it is a sacred site, and there's a lot of monasteries in this particular area, and it's very religious. So you can see how it is sacred to a lot of people. There's people with crutches and in wheelchairs, looking like they're coming here to try and get healed.
From this sacred region of Portugal, we headed to another area full of megaliths, but we did stop en route as there was a structure worth seeing.
Alright, so I wanted to show this dolmen here because of this obvious feature right at the front here. And I wanted to show this because it's hard to associate these dolmen in Europe to those that are found in India or Korea, for example. They're often different sizes and different shapes. But if we can show similar features from those around the world, such as this hole, then maybe we can show that there was a global civilization that built all these megaliths. And you find holes such as this one in dolmen in India and in Russia. I've also shown some in France and in Turkey, for example, that have like a little doorway at the bottom of it. Like with the stone circle we visited a few days ago, in the hole in the tree here, there is a little plastic container, and it's got these notes inside and best wishes and all sorts of messages from people that have come to visit this really pretty site. This capstone on top here is in its original position. It's probably about 3 or 4 tons in weight. There are 7 of these upright stones, the orthostats they're called, and they are supporting this massive capstone. You can probably see at the back there the hole in the front of the dolmen. This is referred to by the locals as the hole of the soul. And other locals around the world also relate these dolmen to the angelic state, maybe. So they say that it was a place where you could contact the ancestors. It was a place where you could meditate and reach higher states of consciousness. So the name, the Hole of the Soul, suggests that to me. So it's in a beautiful valley. This is really a spectacular place. If you're ever, close to Evora in Portugal, then I would certainly recommend it. It's cool. It's a nice place to break from the sun if you go inside. It's a weird stone too. It's got some kind of weird surface to it. It looks a little bit different to most of the stones we've seen in this area.
Whilst looking for our next site, which unfortunately wasn't signposted, we accidentally bumped into a curious dolmen in the centre of a tiny village.
So, this looks like a little chapel, but it's actually a dolmen. Well, I guess it's both, to be honest. It's a dolmen that was converted into a chapel in the 17th century. You see a little cross on top, there's a little church bell. These are the sides of the dolmen, the orthostats, and they're about 7 or 8 meters tall. There's 7 of them, and inside they've created this beautiful mosaic out of tiles. You can see the capstone on the top there, and behind me, Cafe Dolmen, serving Portugal's finest beers.
There are examples of dolmen converted into chapels in other parts of Portugal. We visited another one that was originally built in the 15th century, although the church was enlarged a few hundred years later, so the dolmen became a side room. Inside this one there was also an altar with a traditional Portuguese mosaic on it. Eventually we arrived at our next site, but filming at the converted church made us a little bit behind schedule.
Okay, so this is the cheap man's way to show a stone circle at night time. We don't have a very high budget. They look quite cool, I think, actually, in the headlights of the car. We plan to camp here, but there's this barbed wire fence in the way and nowhere to park the car on this dirt track. so we can't be bothered with that really. So because there's another stone circle just down the road where there's a car park next to it, so it's going to be a little bit easier for us. Plus our camping stuff is so wet from camping the other night where it was a bit of a storm and stuff, but okay. Yeah, it's drying slowly. Okay, so this was the stone circle we camped at last night. You can see it is a smaller circle. There are 6 stones remaining. There were originally 8 apparently. They found 2 cavities. I think over here it says between menhirs 5 and 6, which I imagine was those. So they found 2 holes basically. So originally there were 8. They were in a horseshoe shape, so different shapes to some of the other ones we've seen. There are also some other stones associated with it. There is one about 50 or 60 meters just over there, which is a similar height to these ones. And I'm suspicious that that would actually point to the summer solstice sunrise, similar to Almendres. We saw the sunrise this morning and it was a bit over to the right, but we're filming in November. So I would think it would be worth to have a look at whether that actually points towards the sunrise on the summer solstice. There's another stone over here, about 20 meters just over there on the other side of the road behind that tree. It's been heavily reconstructed. You can see this stone here is, there's a big cut there. It was obviously fallen and they've puzzled this back together, but I don't think they've done a very good job, to be honest with you. It looks wonky and there's bits overlapping and it doesn't really look like a very good fit. These stones, compared to some of the others, are multicolored. They're quite nice actually. There's this kind of pink tint to them and there's some yellow in there too and some grey. So it makes it look really pretty in this morning sunlight. A lovely cup of tea. This is the stone circle we were filming in the headlights last night. It is a very small one, again, only 12 stones. A couple of them are just over a metre, and then there's one here that's only about 20 centimetres. Again, there's some colour in some of these stones. It's said online that this is a horseshoe shape. It's found on private land. We luckily met the owner and he gave us permission to come on and film this site and another one, which is just up the road, which we're going to go and see as well, which is pretty interesting. Another thing to point out actually is all these white dots that you can probably see on the ground are crystals. There's tons and tons of them. There's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. Some are like pink quartz, some are just completely clear, some have got like an orange tint to them. Again, I'm sure that is significant because the crystals and megalithic sites seem to have an association of some kind. So I can see thousands around me. Some of them are massive as well. We were videoing some over by the road there and they are pretty sizable. So, but anyway, we'll go and check out the next site up the road.
Bem te avisei, meu amor, que não podia dar certo e era coisa de evitar. Como eu devias supor que com gente ali tão perto alguém fosse reparar. Mas não, fizeste beicinho e como numa promessa ficaste nua para mim. Pedaço de mar.
This is a stone alignment. These menhirs don't just appear on their own, they also appear in lines like this. This is pretty unique for Portugal. This is the only site that I know of where they are appearing in a line like this. This area was actually some kind of necropolis. There was a tumulus and they found some more stones that are on their side, at least 6, they say there might be more. They've excavated here and they found pottery remains and a few organic artifacts, and they think that this was dated back to the early Neolithic, like the other sites in this area that we've seen. So as I said, this is the only site that I know of in Portugal, but they are found in other places around the world. The most famous would be in Karnak, where there are 3,000 to 4,000 menhirs all in those lines. They're also found in another place in the south of France called Chapel-Dolmen, where there's about 150 stones in this area, some in lines. They're also found in the UK. The most famous would be the corridor that leads up to Avebury, And there's also another corridor or two corridors associated with the stone circle in Callanish. So they are associated with stone circles, but also just out in the middle of nowhere. There's some in Devon where there's just a line of stones and there's nothing associated with it. So one thing that's interesting about this site is that they say that there was actually like a pavement here as well. So these stones were surrounded by a stone floor, which is, funnily enough, something that I saw at the west end of Lemenec in Karnak. You can see what I suddenly noticed on camera was what looked like a stone floor, basically. So yeah, it's not a megalithic feature that you see very often, so that's why I wanted to show this one.
After that site, we drove about 100 kilometres northeast to the area around Marval, an area also full of megaliths.
So this is another standing stone. This is a pretty big one actually. It's 7.1 meters tall. It's in an area full of megaliths. This is like another megalithic hotspot. There's supposed to be quite a few dolmen, and there's also another standing stone about 10 kilometers from here. This is also supposed to have been attributed to the cult of fertility. This is supposed to be another phallic object, but I personally don't see it. Local folklore as well suggests that if you grind up some of this stone and eat the dust, it's going to increase your sexual performance. So I'm not sure exactly how much evidence they have for this, but anyway, there is for some reason very little growth on this section of the stone, and there's quite a lot on this bit here, so I'm not sure why that is. There's also a line of crystal forming just on this side of the stone, which is also the direction of the other menhir in this area. So maybe there's some energy being transmitted between the two. Maria Wheatley has done some great work. She did a presentation at one of the basis conferences, and she suggests that there are 5 lines of energy evenly distributed throughout these standing stones. And she also says that when you get closer to them, that your mass varies as well, which is quite interesting. So as I said, it's about 7.1 meters, the biggest in Portugal. In terms of stones around the world, they do get bigger than this. The largest is probably the Grand Menhir de Brissay in Karnak in France. And that one is now split into 4 pieces and was supposed to have been about 20 meters when it was originally erected. So you can probably see some patches of concrete around here, because when they found this, they found it in 2 different pieces. They did some excavations. They didn't find much at this one, but at the other stone in the area, they found some charcoal, and they've dated that to, I think it was 6,200 BC. So they suggest that these standing stones were the first megaliths that were built, and that also they are pretty ancient as well.
We set off towards the menhir of Patalou, but stopped a few kilometres short to see some stone cysts located on the edge of a huge reservoir. They are a structure associated with other megalithic sites and believed by some to be the remains of barrows or a similar type of structure. They are usually found with ornaments and thought to be coffin-like boxes to hold the bodies of the dead, examples of which can be found across Europe and in the Middle East, such as these we found at a burial site in the north of Poland. The menhir of Patalou is supposed to be another fertility cult erection weighing in at 7 tons and measuring an eye-watering 4 meters long. It now sits 6 meters north of its original location and was another great place to camp and watch the sunrise. Close to these menhirs, hidden in the Municipal Museum of Marval, we found displays on the megaliths in the region, and a curious cow's head, the final remains of a group of structures known as Los Verracos, which are stone statues of boars, bulls, and occasionally other animals as well. This head interested us because we discovered other zoomorphic sculptures on Mount Slange during our trip around Poland, so we wondered if there is a connection. From researching online, we only found a few complete Verracos within the Portuguese borders, but we did find out they exist in much greater numbers all over the west of Spain. There are said to be over 400 statues of bulls and boar, particularly in the area surrounding Avila, so we couldn't resist crossing the border and going hunting for some stone animals. Before touring the area, we paid a visit to the museum in the city to see a collection of 10 or more Verracos in various conditions. Then we walked around the historic centre to see some of the stone animals on display. Funnily enough, the Verracos have been used as a building material over the years, such as the head coming out of one of the towers high up on the Avila castle wall. And there are other examples from more recent constructions, such as the house in another of these small villages in the surrounding area, where 2 statues are built into the front of it.
So here we have the largest example of these. This is about 2.5 meters tall. It's in the plaza of one of these really nice little mountain villages. There's an example of each. This is a boar. You can see this sort of spine going down the centre of its back. This one is a bull, I think. You can probably see from the massive shoulders it's got. They've had to reconstruct it. This is a metal back half of it. One thing that really stands out is all these crystals. It's absolutely chock-a-block full of these beautiful white crystals here, both of them.
Los Verracos are officially dated from the beginning of the 4th century BC to the 3rd century AD. Those we found in Poland were attributed to the Pagan, so considered older, and funnily enough, one of the statues in Poland was considered to be a bear.
This one is supposed to be a bear. It looks much like the other ones that are boars or pigs, but it is in a little village or collection of houses, more like, called El Oso, which is Spanish for the bear, and I think they named the town after this. It's outside a church, which a lot of them seem to be. I'll leave it up to you to decide. Pig, bear, cow, bull.
There are various hypotheses for their existence, including that they were a symbol of wealth in a cattle-raising environment, or they were stones marking winter pasture lands, or possibly even boundary stones indicating borders between different ethnic territories. Others suggest they represented religious deities and were used to protect the cattle, and although one of these suggestions could be right, the real reason could also be missing from this list. After our mini tour of Spain, we jumped back across the border and went straight to the stunning medieval village of Monsanto, which is known as the most Portuguese village in Portugal, sitting 800 metres above sea level with spectacular views. It features narrow streets built around gigantic 200-ton boulders that have been used as walls, floors, and most surprisingly as roofs for houses that date back to the 16th century. Officially, humans have inhabited this area since the time of the last ice age. The Romans settled here, and the Knights Templar used it as a stronghold, building a huge castle in the 10th century which sits on top of the hill next to the village. On the walk up to the castle you pass various ruined chapels, a couple of which were called St Michael's and another was called St Mary's, so there might be a connection to the famous St Michael's ley line. When you walk around this living museum you can sense the history, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was in a dream and that those boulders had been placed there by intelligent hands. There were holes of various shapes and sizes carved into the rock, some like seats you can sit in, others like huge cut marks, and at the necropolis of St Michael there were around 10 to 15 holes that looked like they were created for human bodies to be placed in. We found what looked like cart ruts leading off the side of a mountain ledge, a feature that looks like cartwheels of carved tracks into the rock, and a feature that is found at many locations around the world, most famously in Malta, but also in other places around Europe, as well as Mexico, Turkey and India. Whilst we were leaving town, we passed a bar selling something I just couldn't resist.
What are you drinking?
This is a cocktail called Mania. We were wandering around Monsanto and we walked past a bar that had this sign on it with a standing stone, and it's a aphrodisiac cocktail. So I'm thinking this is something to do with the fact that the locals believe if you grind this stone up and put it in something, it increases sexual performance. So I'm going to try one. It's vodka, some fruit, and I think it shows the tradition, not the actual drink itself. It's pretty lush. It's pretty nice.
This is quite an interesting site. We have these sepulturas, or tombs, carved into the rock. You can see this one here is kind of human, well, it is human shaped. It's probably about 1.5 meters. So these were built for small people. There's different sizes. There's one that looks like it was for a 2 or 3 year old child. Behind me here, there's a couple more. This one was probably, if these are tombs, would have been for a 5 or 6 year old child. There's another one here that's more like for a teenager. Both of these are carved out of rocks just balancing on top of the bedrock here, and they've lost their size for some reason. I guess the erosive forces have really taken their toll on some of these rocks. In this area there are 54 of these little tombs carved out of the rock. There's another one here. This one's pretty interesting because it looks like it's got space for a head, and on this side I'm guessing you would put your feet in there, but this one's quite small as well. This one's probably about 1.3, 1.4 meters tall. There's more up here. There's two there, two there. Close to this massive rock here, which looks like it's been placed there by giants, there's probably about 15 just in this area, just around it, but they're also dotted over these hills as well. So it's been inhabited throughout the ages. There's a little medieval settlement, or I say settlement, it looks more like a building, to be honest. Our contribution from our society is to put some massive electricity pylons, which really do not make this beautiful countryside look very good, to be honest. But I'm not too sure that these were not carved out by the civilization that built all these megaliths. I can't see why in the medieval times they would have spent so much effort to carve out of these rocks, because to dig a hole this big in the dirt is going to take you hours. To carve it out of these rocks is going to take you weeks and weeks and weeks. So maybe these were used for some other purpose.
These tombs are found at many places in Portugal. We went to another site with some larger examples that were carved more precisely and looked well finished. There were also various other shapes carved into the rock that made me wonder if these body-shaped holes were actually intended to house the dead at all, but were actually used for a more mechanical purpose. Some of the carvings looked like they had been created for liquid to run through, and there was a line around the inside of the so-called tombs where the rock had changed colour, like a liquid had been stored there and altered the rock in some way. This is also seen in other countries. During a visit to Bulgaria, I visited a site on top of a hill where there are shapes carved into the rock that made me feel like I was walking around an ancient factory or smelting works. In Monsanto, I had to lie down in one of these holes and found that if I hummed at a certain frequency, it felt like the chamber started to resonate. Something I have experienced at other sites around the world, which makes me wonder if the frequencies of the chambers match those used for healing. In the Hypogeum in Malta, the harmonics due to the shape of the underground temple has been used for meditation or reaching higher states of consciousness. Maybe this is another reason these holes were carved into the rock.
So we're in the north of the centre of Portugal, and we're looking for some different types of dolmen. And we've just come across this one next to the road. It's literally about 15 metres from the road. We saw it while we were driving past. This is my favourite type because it's freestanding. There's no mound or anything. Well, there's this little tiny one here, but it looks like a sculpture against this beautiful countryside. We've driven through an area that was completely burnt out in the 2017. They've had quite a lot of fires in the countryside in Portugal. This dolmen is particularly interesting. It's another freestanding example, although there's a little bit of a mound still left here. It's probably about 3 meters tall. There's about 10 of these orthostat stones supporting a huge capstone. This is probably about 4 or 5 tons, I would think. But the reason I wanted to show this one is because it's absolutely full of crystals. You might be able to see on the stones as we walk in that there's just loads and loads of crystals jumping out of the stone here. There's also some lines of quartz going through it. Here, for example, there is a massive line of quartz going through this stone. It's on the other side as well, so it goes right the way through the stone. There's also one on the capstone up here, and on this stone on the other side, there is a line there. doesn't go right through to the other side, but there's also one on this side which also doesn't come through. Now the reason I wanted to show all these crystals is because it's a feature I notice a lot in all these megalithic sites around the world. Some stand out in particular, some that I saw in Spain or Poland, for example. But there's always a lot of crystals. There's also crystals like lying around the ground outside. Now for me it's interesting because these quartz crystals have something called the piezoelectric effect, where if you put them under pressure they release electrons, and this is used in modern day technology. In microchips, for example, you have these tiny little crystals, and whether they're releasing electrons or not produces the ones and zeros for binary code. So it's an important feature for our modern day technology, and possibly was used by the ancients. So it's particularly interesting to show this one because it's absolutely chock-a-block. You can see again, there's burnt out sections just around here. Luckily the dolmen got saved. I don't think I've ever seen, it's so obvious, these crystals jumping out of the rock in this way. I mean, some of them, it's almost like they've been stuck on with super glue or something.
There are different types of dolmen in Portugal, and indeed the world. They can just look like freestanding stone tables or sculptures like those we have seen so far, or they can have corridors of varying sizes that lead up to the main chamber, both of which can be embedded within or completely covered by a mound. We headed into the mountains, and after hours of twisting around mountain roads, we arrived feeling a little car sick at an embedded dolmen with a 2-meter tall chamber.
Yeah, it's a nice one. There's about 9 of these orthostats. This capstone has got to be in the 3-ton range. And again, like how they drag these stones from up and down these hills. I've got no idea how they would have done that 5,000 years ago. These type of dolmen are not so much like the sculpture type that we've seen so far. These are more like houses or places where people would have lived or done something, you know. This corridor is tiny. I'm not sure if this was built for this reason, because if they were, you know, people of our size, then you would have surely built a corridor bigger than that, or not put the stones on top. There are 3 little stones, each probably less than half a ton. The view from here is beautiful. I mean, I know we feel sick, but the view from the top of this mountain is pretty spectacular.
They have built a road running through this mound, so a section has been removed, revealing the small stones the structure is built from. This could be showing stages of construction from different ages. The initial megalithic section, which has been added to at a later date by people using much smaller building blocks. Another reason that suggests these sites were built at different times is the inconsistency in the degradation of the structures. We went to visit a couple of examples of dolmen with corridors where there really wasn't much left. And what makes these interesting is that they are grouped together with another 5 sites, so they are only a stone's throw away from some much more complete structures.
This is an example of a dolmen that is both within a mound and has a corridor. Off behind me here, they're hunting in the area, obviously. That's brilliant. There's too many animals on the planet, isn't there? Anyway, this is a massive capstone, probably about 10 tons or something like that. You've got a corridor that runs off in this direction for about 10 meters. It's quite small, you have to really try and crawl through it. We came here because it's in a region where there are loads and loads of dolmen. These hills are absolutely dotted with them. We've been driving past tons and tons of signs that say Anta, which is Portuguese for dolmen. Now, I wanted to show this dolmen because it is part of a massive circuit. There are 6 or 7 dolmen really close to here, and I wanted to show basically that often these dolmen are on their own with nothing for miles around, and sometimes they're really clustered together. We showed in a couple of our films some clusters of dolmen on hills in the Pyrenees in Spain, and also in Israel and Jordan. And also they're found in places like Russia, India and Korea. There's just clusters of these beautiful structures. We visited some of the other ones here. There's a couple of quite small ones, and you can go inside them, but they're sort of embedded in the earth a little bit. But there's a really, really cool one where it looks like in medieval times they built a house around it. I say that because it's built out of stone, and it looks like a lot of these castles we visit. I don't know what the age is basically, but they've just adapted a dolmen and turned it into a house. And this makes a point that I've tried to make before, and that is when they find these artifacts at these sites and they date them, how do we know that the artifacts they found there were actually left by the builders of these structures. So this illustrates the point, you know, somebody's come along at a later date and adapted it for their needs. So I keep saying it, but this is truly in a beautiful region. Sadly, it's the region that was affected by the fires, as we've shown in some of the other dolmen. As we were driving along this circuit to come to some of these sites, you could see how it's burnt on one side and not on the other. But luckily, these dolmen have survived.
Toda a gente sabe que os homens são brutos.
So, when I was researching this film, this was supposed to be a walk up this trail, walking through the Portuguese woodlands, me almost like macheting my way through the undergrowth, so to speak. But as you can see, these fires we've been talking about at some of the sites have completely devastated this area. It's really blackened out. Lots of ash and little tree stumps covered in bits of charcoal and, well, turned into charcoal actually. But the reason I wanted to come here was to show this dolmen here, or it could possibly be a cairn, a round barrows, a burial chamber. It has all sorts of different names for what is essentially a dolmen covered in earth. Now we have a stone circle or ring of stones at the base of this little hillock or mound. And this would be the capstone. It's probably about 3 meters by 4 meters, more or less, and probably weighs, I would guess, about 4 tons, maybe 3, maybe 5. Down here is a little doorway. Again, capstone, some orthostats, also quite a lot of crystal in these stones here. The corridor runs off for about 5 or 6 meters, and then there's a small chamber. It's completely filled with ash now, and experts say that the majority of these dolmen were originally covered by earth and there were mounds. I find that a little bit difficult to believe because, from my understanding, the soil builds up over time, and you get the vegetation and organic material as well as sand and dust and all these kind of things that basically form like a sediment of soil. So I'm not sure why they think that erosive forces just kind of washed away the mounds on these freestanding dolmen we've seen. But I could be corrected on that. But as far as I was aware, that it's flash floods and things like that that caused the soil to be washed away. So there's quite an apocalyptic feel walking through this devastated woodland, but we've been just down a hill here videoing some little bush shoots, some grass and some pretty little flowers growing back. So it's nice to see that even though these fires were here, let's say 3 or 4 weeks ago, that life is already returning.
This site is basically a dolmen with a corridor covered in earth, but there are examples where they are completely covered in stones and no earth is incorporated into the structure. We drove to the south coast about 15 kilometers from Lagos to visit a stone cairn made from an outer layer of darker flintstones with white limestone rocks forming the central part of the mound. It is around 15 to 20 meters wide with other megalithic stones lying around the outside, and this is one of 20 such structures within a square kilometre. 2 have been reconstructed, but the rest are completely destroyed. You can walk up and see the central chamber with 3 holes. One that leads along a 5 metre long corridor with megalithic capstones acting as the roof, and at the other end is a tiny doorway in the front of the cairn. The other 2 holes are body-sized caverns built into the side of the inner chamber, and there is a third space for a body that is hidden behind the chamber wall. The doorway is really small, just over 1 metre in height, and the guy working there told us they found a metre-tall skeleton buried with some grave goods. The second cairn is considerably smaller than the first, and still being reconstructed today.
Over here, we've got a lovely little demonstration of how they move these massive megalithic blocks. I mean, on little logs with rope. Now this one is probably half a ton, and well, I'm never going to be able to move this, but I showed in one of my videos how there was a team in France who tried to reconstruct a dolmen and a standing stone using these techniques, and it took a lot of people. It was like 20 to 30 of them, and these were only tiny stones. I mean, some of the biggest megaliths in the world are over 1,000 tons, like Baalbek and Aswan in Egypt, where there's these 1,200 ton menhirs. So how on earth they honestly think they were going to move these using this technique, I've got no idea. But, you know, this assumes that these people 5,000, 7,000 years ago weren't as intellectually advanced as us. You know, they were just cavemen and they basically poured rocks on stones. But other people online suggest that they could have had other ways using, you know, meditation and hovering these stones. Maria Wheatley, as I mentioned, has shown how people's weight changes as they get closer to these standing stones in England. So maybe they were using these kind of energies and manipulation of energies to just hover these stones or make them super light so they can just carry them, you know. So also, this is on top of a hill. So it's fair enough to move stones in this way when it's flat, but going uphill?
Not far from this collection of cairns, an intriguing 1.8 metre long stone was found with a symbol carved onto it, which people say resembles the DNA double helix. Some researchers believe this stone is an egg of cosmic creation, a global phenomenon that spreads across nearly all ancient cultures. Interestingly, the researcher who found this egg believes that this fascinating item has a connection with Atlantis, and after spending 3 weeks getting to know just a small percentage of the megalithic sites in Portugal, I can believe a connection is there, especially when you add the facts that Portugal touches the Atlantic Ocean and it's completely covered in crystals. Although our trip was almost over, we did have time to stop off at a pretty interesting place that is supposed to be at the crossing point of some major ley lines. Sintra is magical, full of palaces and castles, and it was the house of the royal family for centuries. There was a well that you could walk down into, and then you could exit via a tunnel system that runs through the area. And this reminded us how much has been discovered under the ground in recent years at various places around the world, and it made us wonder how much there could be buried under the ground in Portugal.
Okay, red lorry, yellow lorry, red lorry, yellow.